The blood on his shirt caught everyone's eye when Archer Ingram rode into Madisonville, Texas, in the summer of 1875. But none stared quite as boldly as Lillian Dawson, who didn't flinch from the crimson stain spreading across his chest like the other women who whispered behind their hands. Archer dismounted from his chestnut stallion, feeling his body ache from the 3-day ride. Madisonville was supposed to be his fresh start, away from the troubles that had followed him since the war. The town wasn't much a main street with the essentials: general store, saloon, sheriff's office, and a small church at the far end. But it was far enough from his past, or so he thought. He tied his horse to the post outside the general store, planning to gather supplies before finding somewhere to stay. That's when he noticed her, a tall woman with honey-colored hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet, her blue dress simple but well kept. She wasn't looking at his face, though. Her eyes were fixed on the bloodstain. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steady as she approached him. Archer glanced down at his shirt and shook his head. "It ain't mine." Instead of recoiling or hurrying away like he expected, she stepped closer. "Then let me wash it anyway," she said. "You'll draw unwanted attention looking like that." Archer studied her face, searching for fear or disgust, but found neither. Just a practical assessment and something else, curiosity, perhaps. "I don't need your help, miss," he replied, tipping his hat slightly, "but I appreciate the offer." "I'm Lillian Dawson," she continued, undeterred. "My father runs the boarding house just down the street. We have a room available, and I suspect you'll need one." Archer hesitated. He hadn't planned on staying in a boarding house, too many eyes, too many questions. But something about her directness intrigued him. "Archer Ingram," he replied finally, "just passing through." "No one's just passing through Madisonville, Mr. Ingram. We're not on the way to anywhere." She smiled slightly, revealing a dimple in her left cheek. "The room includes a hot bath and dinner, and I'm quite good with laundry." Before Archer could respond, the door to the general store swung open, and an older man with a shotgun stepped out onto the boardwalk. "Everything all right, Lillian?" The man asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in Archer's bloodied appearance. "Just fine, Mr. Peterson. This gentleman needs directions to my father's boarding house." Her voice was sweet but firm, leaving no room for argument. Mr. Peterson nodded reluctantly and retreated into his store, though he kept watching through the window. "You didn't have to do that," Archer said quietly. "This town talks, Mr. Ingram, and that blood is already saying plenty." She gestured down the street. "The boarding house is the white 2-story with the blue trim. Tell my father I sent you." She turned to leave but paused. "And Mr. Ingram, whatever trouble you're running from, I suggest you leave it outside our door." As she walked away, Archer found himself watching the determined set of her shoulders, the way she nodded politely to townsfolk as she passed. He hadn't planned on staying more than a night, but something about Lillian Dawson made him reconsider. The weight of his gun pressed against his hip, a constant reminder of the 3 men who had followed him from Austin. One was no longer a problem, the owner of the blood on his shirt, but the other 2 wouldn't be far behind. Getting attached to a place like Madisonville was dangerous, especially for a woman like Lillian who looked at a blood-soaked stranger and offered laundry services instead of judgment. Still, he led his horse down the dusty street toward the white house with blue trim. One night wouldn't hurt. He could use a proper bath and a real meal before moving on. The Dawson boarding house was well maintained, with a wide porch and rocking chairs that suggested comfort and permanence, things Archer had long ago stopped associating with his own life. He tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps, his spurs jingling with each movement. The door opened before he could knock. A man with graying hair and Lillian's same direct gaze stood in the doorway. "Mr. Ingram, I presume," he said, looking Archer over with a critical eye. "My daughter has a habit of collecting strays." "Daniel Dawson, I take it," Archer replied. "Your daughter mentioned you had a room available." Daniel's eyes lingered on the bloodstain. "She mentioned that too, said it wasn't yours." "It isn't?" Daniel stepped back, allowing Archer inside. $2 a night includes a room, bath, and meals. No drinking, no fighting, no women in your room. I run a respectable establishment." "Understood," Archer said, reaching for the money in his pocket. "And Mr. Ingram," Daniel added quietly, "while I respect a man's privacy, I don't tolerate anything that might bring danger to my door or my daughter." Archer met his gaze steadily. "I don't plan on staying long enough to be a problem." Daniel nodded, taking the money Archer offered. "Rooms upstairs, last one on the right. Dinner's at 6. Lillian's preparing a bath for you in the washroom out back." Archer climbed the stairs, feeling the events of the past week catching up to him. The room was simple but clean: a bed, a washstand, a small table with a chair, and a window overlooking the street. He placed his saddlebags on the bed and removed his gun belt. Laying it within easy reach from his window, he could see most of the town's main street. It was quiet, peaceful even. The kind of place people put down roots, the kind of place he always rode through. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Ingram," Lillian's voice came through the wood, "your bath is ready." He opened the door to find her holding a stack of towels and a bar of soap. "I'll take your shirt," she said matter-of-factly. "I should be able to salvage it." Archer found himself speechless for a moment, caught off guard by her practicality. "I can wash my own clothes, Miss Dawson." "Of course you can," she replied with that same slight smile, "but I'm better at it." "Blood requires a special touch to remove completely." He raised an eyebrow. "You have experience with bloodstains?" "My father was the town doctor before arthritis forced him to open this boarding house instead. I assisted." She held out her hand expectantly. "The shirt, Mr. Ingram." Archer hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt and handed it to her, suddenly aware of the scars that crisscrossed his torso, remnants of the war and the decade since. If Lillian was shocked by the sight, she didn't show it. She simply took the shirt, handed him the towels and soap, and pointed toward the back stairs. "The washroom is through the kitchen and out the back door. I've heated enough water for a proper bath. Dinner will be ready when you're finished." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "And Mr. Ingram, whatever story goes with that blood and those scars, it can wait for another day." With that, she turned and headed down the stairs, leaving Archer staring after her, wondering what kind of woman looked at a scarred, blood-covered stranger and saw anything worth salvaging. The bath was the first luxury Archer had allowed himself in months. The hot water eased the tension from his muscles, and the soap scented faintly with something clean and herbaceous, removed days of trail dust and dried blood from his skin. As he bathed, he considered his next move. The smarter choice would be to leave at first light, before the remaining men tracking him could reach Madisonville. But as he dressed in clean clothes from his saddlebag, he found himself curious about Lillian Dawson and her father. They weren't typical small-town folks, quick to judge and quicker to gossip. There was something refreshing about their directness, especially Lillian's. He made his way downstairs, following the smell of cooking to the dining room. Daniel was already seated at the head of the table, and two other boarders, an elderly woman and a young man who appeared to be a clerk from the bank, sat on one side. Lillian was placing a large pot of stew in the center of the table. "Ah, Mr. Ingram," Daniel said as Archer entered. "Join us. This is Mrs. Whittaker. She's been with us for 3 years, and Mr. James, who's been here for 6 months." Archer nodded to them both and took the empty seat across from them, which happened to be next to where Lillian would sit. "Your shirt is soaking," Lillian informed him as she placed a basket of bread on the table. "It should be ready to scrub by morning." "Thank you," Archer replied, oddly touched by her matter-of-fact kindness. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with Mrs. Whittaker sharing town gossip and Mr. James discussing the bank's business. Archer remained mostly silent, contributing only when directly addressed, but he found himself watching Lillian when she wasn't looking. She was older than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she found joy easily. Her hands were capable and strong, not the delicate hands of a lady who'd never worked, but those of a woman who knew her worth lay in what she could do, not how she appeared. After dinner, while the others retired to the parlor, Lillian caught Archer's arm as he was about to head upstairs. "Would you care to sit on the porch for a while?" she asked. "The evenings are pleasant this time of year." Archer knew he should decline. Getting to know Lillian Dawson any better would only complicate things when he inevitably had to leave, but he found himself nodding anyway. They sat in rocking chairs, the twilight settling around them like a comfortable blanket. For several minutes, neither spoke, simply watching as Madisonville prepared for night shopkeepers closing up, the lamplighter making his rounds, a few men heading toward the saloon at the end of the street. "How long have you been running?" Lillian asked finally, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. Archer stiffened. "What makes you think I'm running?" She turned to look at him, her expression gentle but knowing. "The blood that isn't yours. The way you checked every exit when you entered our dining room. The gun you're still wearing even though we're just sitting on a porch watching fireflies." He hadn't realized she'd noticed so much. "You're observant." "I had to be, assisting my father." "You learn to read people when you're helping them through their worst moments." She rocked slowly. "So how long?" Archer sighed, seeing no point in denying what she'd already deduced. "On and off for about 10 years. More consistently these past few months." "What happened a few months ago?" "I stopped in the wrong town, trusted the wrong person." He rubbed his jaw where a faint scar remained from that encounter. "Made enemies I didn't intend to make. And the blood on your shirt." Archer was quiet for a long moment. "One of those enemies caught up to me yesterday." "He didn't leave me much choice." Lillian nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "And the others? 2 more, as far as I know. They won't be far behind." He looked at her directly. "I'll be gone by morning. I appreciate your hospitality, but I won't bring trouble to your door." "And where will you go?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years, not out of genuine concern for his welfare, at least. West, probably, maybe New Mexico territory. And then, find work for a while, move on when necessary. It was the pattern of his life since the war, never staying, never settling. Lillian was quiet for a long time, her rocking chair creating a gentle rhythm. "My mother died when I was 16, she said finally. "Consumption. For 3 years after that, I was angry at everything, God, this town, even my father for not being able to save her, despite being a doctor." Archer remained silent, unsure why she was telling him this. "I left Madisonville when I was 19. Went to Dallas, then San Antonio, then all the way to New Orleans." She smiled slightly. "I was running too in my way." "What brought you back?" he asked. "My father fell ill. By the time I returned, he had recovered, but his hands were too arthritic to continue his practice. We opened the boarding house together." She looked at him. "The point is, Mr. Ingram, running doesn't solve problems, it just postpones them." "Some problems can't be solved," Archer replied grimly. "Only survived." Lillian stood, smoothing her skirt. "Well, if you're determined to leave tomorrow, at least let me finish washing your shirt properly. No sense riding out looking like you just killed a man, even if you did." Her bluntness startled a laugh out of him, the first genuine laugh he'd experienced in longer than he could remember. "You're not like most women I've met, Miss Dawson." "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Ingram." She headed toward the door but paused with her hand on the knob. "And for what it's worth, I think there's more to your story than you're telling. If you'd care to share the rest sometime, I'm a good listener." With that, she disappeared inside, leaving Archer alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of piano music drifting from the saloon down the street. He stayed on the porch long after the town had gone dark, watching for any sign of the men who were tracking him. His plan remained unchanged. He would leave at first light, before he brought danger to this household. Before Lillian Dawson and her straightforward compassion could complicate his carefully constructed solitude any further. But as he finally headed upstairs to his room, he found himself wondering what it might be like to stop running, to face his problems instead of outpacing them. To stay in one place long enough to know the rhythm of days, the changing of seasons, to know a woman like Lillian beyond a single evening's conversation. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams of blood on his hands that wouldn't wash away, no matter how hard he scrubbed. In these dreams, Lillian stood watching him, her expression sad but unsurprised, as if she'd expected nothing less. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and quietly gathered his few possessions. He paused at the small table where he'd left payment for the room, considering whether to add a note. But what would he say? Thank you for your kindness. Sorry for the blood. Goodbye. In the end, he left only the money, $2 for the room and an extra $1 for the trouble. He made his way downstairs, careful to avoid the steps that had creaked under his weight the night before. The kitchen, however, was not empty as he'd expected. Lillian stood at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she stirred something in a pot. His freshly washed and pressed shirt lay folded on the table. I thought you might try to sneak out, she said without turning around. Your shirt is clean, not even a hint of blood remains. Archer picked up the shirt, noting the faint scent of lye soap and something floral. You didn't have to do this. I know. She finally turned to face him. Coffee. He should decline, should thank her and be on his way before the town fully woke. Instead, he found himself nodding and taking a seat at the kitchen table. Lillian poured him a cup and placed a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of him. Eat. The road west is long. Archer studied her as she moved around the kitchen. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. Did you sleep at all? He asked. She smiled slightly. I was up early to finish your shirt. Bloodstains require patience. You didn't have to do that, he repeated. You mentioned that already. She sat across from him with her own cup of coffee. I had brothers, you know, both died in the war, Confederate side. Archer tensed. I fought for the Union. I guessed as much from your accent. You're from Pennsylvania? Ohio, he corrected, surprised at her perception. Near Cincinnati, she nodded. War's been over for 10 years. Most folks around here have put it behind them. Not everyone, Archer said grimly, thinking of one of the men tracking him, a former Confederate captain who bore a grudge that went beyond the war itself. No, not everyone, Lillian agreed. But most. She sipped her coffee. Those men following you, is it because of the war? Archer considered deflecting but found himself wanting to be honest with her. Partially. One of them, a man named Reynolds, served under a commander I killed during the war, but that's not the whole story. What's the rest? He set down his fork, his appetite suddenly diminished. After the war, I worked as a U.S. Marshal for a while, tracked down some dangerous men, made more enemies. He looked directly at her. 3 months ago, I was in a town called Sweetwater. I was hired to protect a rancher who'd been receiving threats. Turned out the threats were coming from the town's mayor, who wanted the land for a railroad deal. Let me guess, Reynolds was involved. He was the mayor's enforcer. I confronted them both, but things went wrong. The rancher was killed, and so was the mayor's wife, caught in the crossfire. Archer's jaw tightened. Reynolds blamed me, said I shot her, but it was his bullet. The mayor believed him. So now they're hunting you. Reynolds and the mayor's brother. The third man, the one whose blood was on my shirt, was just a hired gun. He pushed his plate away. Now you understand why I need to leave. They won't stop coming. Lillian was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Have you considered stopping, Mr. Ingram, facing them once and for all, and risk more innocent people getting hurt? No. People get hurt whether you're running or standing still, she said softly. At least if you stand your ground, you get to choose the battlefield. Before Archer could respond, the back door opened, and Daniel Dawson entered, carrying an armful of firewood. He paused when he saw Archer at the table. I thought you'd be gone by now, he said, setting down the wood. He was just leaving, Lillian replied, standing to take Archer's plate. Daniel studied his daughter, then looked at Archer. Sheriff Roberts is a good man. If you're in some kind of trouble, he might be able to help. I appreciate the thought, Archer said, rising from his chair. But this isn't the kind of trouble law can fix. Most trouble is if you give it a chance, Daniel countered. He glanced at Lillian, who was busying herself at the sink. My daughter seems to think you're worth helping. She's usually a good judge of character. Your daughter is kind, Archer replied, picking up his freshly cleaned shirt. But kindness can be misplaced. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Son, I've lived long enough to know that genuine kindness is never misplaced. It may not always yield the results we hope for, but it's never wasted. Archer didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, he nodded his thanks and headed toward the door. Lillian followed him. At least change your shirt before you go, she said, handing him the clean one. No sense riding out looking like you're running from something. He took the shirt from her and stepped onto the back porch to change, leaving his bloody one folded on a chair. When he returned, Lillian was waiting with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Biscuits and jerky, she explained. For the road. Why are you doing this? He asked, genuinely puzzled by her continued kindness. She considered the question seriously. Because everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Ingram, even men with blood on their shirts that isn't theirs. Archer took the package, his fingers brushing hers. Thank you, Miss Dawson. Lillian, she corrected. If you're going to remember me, you might as well use my name. Lillian, he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue. And I'm Archer. Safe travels, Archer. She stepped back, giving him room to leave. I hope you find what you're looking for. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't looking for anything, that he'd long ago given up on finding peace or belonging. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded and headed toward the front of the house where his horse was stabled. The morning was cool, the sun just beginning to paint the eastern sky with pink and gold. Madisonville was still mostly asleep, with only a few early risers moving about their business. Archer saddled his horse efficiently, his movements practiced and quick. As he mounted up, he took one last look at the Dawson boarding house. He could see Lillian through the front window, watching him. She raised her hand in a small wave, which he returned before turning his horse toward the western edge of town. He had ridden less than a mile when he heard the sound of approaching riders from the east, the direction he'd come from. Pulling off the road, he concealed himself behind a stand of trees, watching as 3 horsemen came into view. His heart sank as he recognized 2 of them. James Reynolds, the former Confederate captain, and Harold Bennett, the mayor's brother. The third was another hired gun, replacing the one Archer had killed. They rode directly into Madisonville, and Archer knew with cold certainty where they would go first. The blood on his shirt may have been washed away, but the trail it represented led straight to Lillian's door. Archer's first instinct was to continue riding west. These men wanted him, not the Dawsons. If he was gone, they'd follow. But what if they didn't believe the Dawsons when they said he'd already left? What if Reynolds, with his mean streak and quick temper, decided to make an example of them? What if Lillian, with her straightforward manner, challenged them as she had challenged Archer? The thought of her facing those men made his decision for him. Turning his horse around, Archer headed back toward Madisonville, keeping to the trees that lined the road. He wouldn't confront them directly, that would only ensure bloodshed. But he needed to make sure the Dawsons were safe. Approaching town from the north, he left his horse hidden behind the livery stable and made his way on foot toward the boarding house. The streets were busier now, with shops opening and people going about their morning routines. Archer kept his hat pulled low and moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. He reached the alley behind the boarding house just as Reynolds and his companions were tying their horses to the front hitching post. From his position, he could see through the kitchen window to where Lillian was washing dishes, her back to the door. Reynolds knocked on the front door and Archer heard Daniel's voice, though he couldn't make out the words. The conversation seemed civil at first, but then Reynolds' voice rose in anger. "We know he was here. His horse was seen outside last night." Archer moved closer to the back door, drawing his pistol. He couldn't hear Daniel's response, but whatever it was didn't satisfy Reynolds. The front door crashed open. They'd forced their way inside. Without hesitation, Archer slipped through the back door into the kitchen. Lillian spun around, a dish still in her hand, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "Archer, there, I know," he whispered, gesturing for her to stay quiet. "Stay here." He moved silently through the kitchen toward the hallway that led to the front of the house. He could hear Reynolds and Bennett interrogating Daniel in the foyer. "Where did he go?" Reynolds demanded. "Which way was he headed?" "I told you he left at dawn," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the threat. "I don't know which direction he took." "You're lying, old man," Bennett said. "Ingram always heads west when he's running." "Then I suggest you do the same," Daniel answered. "He's got several hours head start on you." Archer reached the doorway between the hallway and the foyer, staying out of sight. From his position, he could see Daniel standing tall despite his age, facing down Reynolds and Bennett. The third man, the hired gun, was watching from near the front door. Reynolds stepped closer to Daniel, his hand moving toward his gun. "I'm losing patience. Your daughter seemed mighty friendly with Ingram last night. Maybe she knows more." At the mention of Lillian, Archer's grip tightened on his pistol. Before he could move, however, Lillian's voice came from behind him. "My father told you the truth," she said, stepping around Archer despite his attempt to stop her. "Mr. Ingram left this morning, headed west." Reynolds' attention shifted to her, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, the friendly little laundress. "I heard you took quite an interest in cleaning Ingram's bloody shirt." Lillian raised her chin. "I take an interest in helping travelers in need. It's our business." "Is that all it was? Business?" Reynolds moved toward her, but Daniel stepped between them. "You've got your information," Daniel said firmly. "Now I'll have to ask you gentlemen to leave." Reynolds laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Oh, we'll leave. But I think the lady might need to come with us. Ingram's developed a habit of caring about people he shouldn't. If he knows we've got her, he might stop running." That was enough for Archer. He stepped into view, his gun aimed at Reynolds' chest. "The only place she's going is right where she is." Reynolds froze, genuine surprise crossing his face before it settled into a calculating smile. "Well, this is convenient. Came back to protect the little woman, did you? Step away from them," Archer said evenly. "Your quarrel is with me." "That it is," Reynolds agreed, his hand hovering near his gun. "For Julia's sake." "Your bullet killed Julia, not mine," Archer replied. "We both know that." Bennett moved slightly to the side, trying to get a better angle. "It doesn't matter whose bullet it was. You're the reason she's dead." "No one else needs to die today," Archer said. "Let's take this outside, away from innocent people." Reynolds glanced at Lillian, then at Daniel. "These folks stopped being innocent the moment they helped you." His hand inched closer to his gun. Archer saw the intent in Reynolds' eyes a split second before the man drew. He fired first, his bullet catching Reynolds in the shoulder, spinning him around. Bennett and the hired gun both drew, firing wildly. "Get down," Archer shouted to Lillian and Daniel, diving behind a hallway table as bullets splintered the wood around him. Daniel pulled Lillian toward the parlor, out of the direct line of fire. Archer returned fire, catching the hired gun in the leg. The man went down with a cry of pain. Bennett, more calculated than Reynolds, had taken cover behind an overturned chair. Reynolds was on one knee, his left shoulder bleeding freely, but his right hand still gripped his pistol. "You can't win this, Ingram," Bennett called. "Even if you kill us, there will be others. You think the law in this town will side with you after you've shot up a respectable boarding house." Archer knew Bennett was right. This was exactly what he'd feared, bringing violence to Lillian's door. He needed to end this quickly before anyone else got hurt. "Reynolds," he called out, "you want me, not them. Let's finish this, you and me." Reynolds laughed, the sound strained with pain. "Why would I agree to that when I've got the advantage?" "Because you've always considered yourself an honorable man," Archer replied. "At least that's what you told Julia." The mention of his lover's name seemed to strike a chord. Reynolds went silent for a moment. "Fine," he said finally. "Just you and me, Ingram, outside." "James, no," Bennett protested. "We've got him cornered." "Shut up, Harold," Reynolds snapped. "This ends today one way or another." He struggled to his feet, still holding his wounded shoulder. Outside Ingram now. Archer knew it could be a trap, but it was also his best chance to move the danger away from the Dawsons. "I'm coming out," he called. "Bennett stays where he is." Reynolds nodded to Bennett, who reluctantly lowered his gun. The hired gun was still on the floor, clutching his bleeding leg. Archer moved carefully toward the front door, his gun still trained on Reynolds. As they stepped onto the porch, the morning sunlight illuminated the scene. Two men, guns drawn, facing each other with years of hatred between them. A small crowd had gathered at the commotion, keeping a safe distance. Among them, Archer spotted a man wearing a sheriff's badge, watching cautiously but making no move to interfere. "This is between me and him," Reynolds announced to the onlookers. "Anyone who interferes will answer to me." "You sure about this, Reynolds?" Archer asked quietly. "It doesn't have to end with more bloodshed." "It ended that way for Julia," Reynolds replied, his voice tight with grief and anger. "She deserves justice." "She deserves the truth," Archer countered. "And the truth is that your bullet killed her when you were aiming for me." "I've never shot a woman and I never would." Reynolds' face contorted. "Liar." "Think about it, James," Archer pressed, using the man's first name for the first time. "You fired 3 shots. One hit the rancher, one hit the wall, and the one that was meant for me hit Julia when she stepped into the doorway." Reynolds' hand trembled slightly. "That's not how I remember it." "Because you don't want to remember it that way," Archer said. "It's easier to blame me than to accept that you killed the woman you loved." For a moment, doubt flickered across Reynolds' face, then his expression hardened. "Enough talking. Draw, you bastard." Archer knew there was no reasoning with him now. Reynolds was too far gone in his grief and guilt, too committed to his version of events. One of them wouldn't walk away from this confrontation. "Archer, wait." Lillian's voice came from the doorway behind him. She had slipped past her father and now stood on the porch, her face pale but determined. "Get back inside," Archer ordered, not taking his eyes off Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds," Lillian said, ignoring Archer's command, "is your vendetta worth more innocent lives, worth your own life?" Reynolds looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to address him directly. "This doesn't concern you, madam," he said, his tone softer than Archer had ever heard it. "It concerns this entire town," she replied. "Including the sheriff, who I believe is ready to arrest whoever fires the first shot." She gestured toward the lawman, who had indeed moved closer, his hand resting on his own pistol. Reynolds hesitated, glancing at the sheriff, then back at Archer. "This isn't over, Ingram." "It can be," Archer said. "Right here, right now, we both put down our guns and walk away." "And what justice does that give Julia?" Reynolds demanded, but his resolve was clearly wavering. "None," Archer admitted, "but it doesn't give her more company in the grave either." A long, tense moment passed. Then, slowly, Reynolds lowered his gun. "I'm not finished with you," he said quietly. "But not today, not here." The sheriff stepped forward. "I think you gentlemen have caused enough excitement in my town. Mr. Reynolds, you and your friends need to get your wounds tended to and then be on your way." Reynolds looked as if he might argue, but the fight seemed to have gone out of him for the moment. He nodded curtly and headed back inside to collect Bennett and their hired gun. Archer didn't lower his gun until Reynolds was out of sight. When he finally did, his hand was trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Lillian moved to his side. "Are you all right? You shouldn't have intervened," he said, more harshly than he intended. "That was dangerous." "So was coming back for us," she replied evenly. "Yet here you are." The sheriff approached them. "Mind telling me what that was all about, mister?" Archer sighed, holstering his gun. "Old grudge, Sheriff, won't trouble your town any further." "See that it doesn't," the lawman replied. "I don't care for gunplay in my streets, especially not in front of a respectable establishment like the Dawsons." He tipped his hat to Lillian. "Madam." As the sheriff walked away, Daniel emerged from the house, looking shaken but unharmed. "Is it over?" "For now," Archer said, watching as Reynolds and his companions mounted their horses down the street, the hired gun helped into his saddle by Bennett. They rode east, the opposite direction from which they'd come. "They'll be back," Daniel observed. "Yes," Archer agreed, "but not today." "And not here," he turned to Lillian. "I'm sorry for bringing this to your door. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent by leaving. And yet you came back," she said, studying his face. Why, Archer wasn't sure how to answer that. The truth was, he hadn't thought about it. He'd simply known he couldn't leave her to face Reynolds alone. "It was the right thing to do," he said finally. Lillian smiled slightly, as if she knew there was more to it than that. "Well, now that you've thoroughly disrupted our morning and put bullet holes in my father's foyer, I believe you owe us a proper explanation. Over breakfast, perhaps? I'm sure you worked up an appetite with all that heroics." Despite the gravity of the situation, Archer found himself smiling at her matter-of-fact manner. "You're an unusual woman, Lillian Dawson. So you've mentioned," she replied, turning toward the door. "Coming, father." Daniel looked between them, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I'll be along. Going to check on Mrs. Whittaker and Mr. James first, make sure they weren't too frightened by all the excitement." As Daniel walked back inside, Lillian paused at the doorway, looking back at Archer. "Are you coming?" He knew he should leave. Reynolds and Bennett had retreated for now, but they would return. The safer choice would be to ride out while he had the chance. But something kept him rooted to that porch, something about the way Lillian looked at him, not as a dangerous man or a victim of circumstances, but as someone worth knowing despite it all. "Yes," he said finally, following her inside. "I'm coming." The next few days passed in a strange sort of limbo. Archer helped Daniel repair the damage to the foyer, replacing splintered wood and patching bullet holes. The town buzzed with gossip about the confrontation, but Sheriff Roberts seemed content to let the matter drop once it was clear the troublemakers had left town. Archer kept expecting Reynolds and Bennett to return, but as each day passed without sign of them, he began to wonder if perhaps the encounter on the porch had affected Reynolds more than he'd realized. Maybe his words about Julia had finally broken through the man's wall of grief and rage. Or maybe they were simply regrouping, planning a more calculated approach. Either way, Archer found himself reluctant to leave Madisonville. He told himself it was because he needed to make sure the danger had truly passed, but he knew there was more to it than that. There was Lillian, with her direct gaze and unexpected insights. There were the quiet evenings on the porch, watching the town settle into night. There was the growing sense that perhaps, just perhaps, he had found something worth staying for. A week after the confrontation, Archer was chopping wood behind the boarding house when Lillian brought him a glass of lemonade. It was a warm day, and he'd removed his shirt, the physical labor a welcome outlet for his restless energy. "Sheriff Roberts just stopped by," she said, handing him the glass. "Thought you'd want to know they found Reynolds." Archer's hand froze halfway to his mouth. "Found him?" Lillian nodded. "Dead, about 20 miles east of here, shot in the back. Bennett? Sheriff thinks so. Apparently, there was some disagreement about how to handle you. Bennett wanted to hire more guns, come back in force. Reynolds wanted to face you alone. At least, that's what they pieced together from what the stable boy in Millbrook overheard." Archer took a long drink of the lemonade, processing this information. "And Bennett headed east, according to witnesses, toward Dallas." She studied his face. "Does this change things for you?" He set down the glass on a nearby stump. "Bennett's not the type to let go of a grudge, but he's also not the type to face it head-on. Without Reynolds driving him, he might decide I'm not worth the trouble." "So you're safe," Archer considered this. "Safer than I was a week ago." "But there's no guarantee Bennett won't change his mind someday." Lillian stepped closer, her skirt brushing against the wood chips at their feet. "Is that enough reason to keep running? The possibility that someday someone might come looking for you," her question cut to the heart of the matter. For 10 years, Archer had been running from one threat or another, some real, some merely perceived. The habit of movement, of never settling, had become so ingrained that he wasn't sure he knew how to stop even when the immediate danger had passed. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been on the move for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." "You've managed a week so far," she pointed out, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "and the boarding house is still standing." He returned her smile, surprising himself. "Your father might disagree." "I think he's still finding bullet fragments in his parlor. Father's tougher than he looks, and he likes having another man around to help with the heavy lifting." Her expression grew more serious. "He's not getting any younger, you know. This place is a lot for him to manage alone." Archer recognized the opening she was offering. "Are you suggesting I might be useful around here? I'm suggesting you might belong here if you wanted to." She held his gaze steadily. "Madisonville could use a man with your skills. Sheriff Roberts mentioned just yesterday that he's looking for a deputy." The idea was so unexpected that Archer wasn't sure how to respond. Him, a deputy, after years of staying just ahead of the law in some places. "I'm not sure the good people of Madisonville would want a man with my history wearing a badge," he said finally. "Maybe not at first," she acknowledged, "but people can change their minds when given reason to." She bent down and picked up his shirt from where he'd draped it over a log. "Besides, your shirts stay much cleaner these days." He took the shirt from her, their fingers brushing briefly. "Is that what matters to you, clean shirts?" "What matters to me," she said, her voice softer now, "is that you came back. When it would have been easier and safer to keep riding, you turned around because you were worried about us." She took a breath. "About me?" Archer found himself at a loss for words. In that moment, with the afternoon sun filtering through the trees and Lillian looking at him with such open honesty, he couldn't remember why he'd ever thought running was the answer. "Lillian," he began, not sure what he was going to say but knowing he needed to say something. She saved him the trouble. Rising onto her tiptoes, she pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Think about it," she whispered before turning and heading back toward the house, leaving Archer staring after her with his shirt clutched forgotten in his hand. That evening after dinner, Archer found Daniel on the front porch smoking a pipe and watching the street. He joined the older man, settling into the now familiar rocking chair. "Sheriff tells me Reynolds is dead," Daniel said without preamble, "so I heard." Daniel nodded, puffing on his pipe. "Man like that, consumed by hatred, it's a hard way to live, harder way to die." "Yes," Archer agreed, thinking of how Reynolds' grief had twisted into something dark and destructive. "Lillian mentioned the sheriff's looking for a deputy," Daniel continued. "She mentioned that to me as well." "It's good work, steady, respectable," Daniel glanced at him. "If you were considering staying, that is." Archer looked out at the main street of Madisonville. In just a week, it had become familiar, the rhythm of the shopkeepers opening and closing, the regular patrons of the saloon, the Sunday crowds at the small church. He could see himself becoming part of this routine, this community. "I'm considering it," he admitted. Daniel nodded, seemingly satisfied. Lillian's mother, Caroline, used to say that a man doesn't know what he's capable of until he stops running long enough to find out. He tapped his pipe against the porch rail. "Smart woman, Caroline. Your daughter takes after her, I suspect, in some ways." Daniel smiled slightly. Caroline was gentler, though, less likely to confront a man with a gun on her front porch. Archer chuckled. "Lillian is certainly direct, that she is." Daniel turned to look at him fully. "She likes you, Ingram, more than liked if I'm reading the signs correctly." Archer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Daniel waved away his protest. "I'm not asking your intentions, not yet anyway, I'm just making an observation." He relit his pipe, which had gone out. Lillian's had suitors before, turned down 2 marriage proposals from perfectly respectable men. Why? Archer couldn't help asking. She said they didn't understand her, wanted to change her, make her more conventional. Daniel shrugged. "Can't say I disagreed with her assessment." Archer thought about this. Lillian was indeed unconventional, a woman who looked at bloodstains and saw laundry problems to solve, who faced armed men with calm reasoning, who offered second chances to strangers who might not deserve them. "She deserves someone who appreciates her as she is," Archer said. "Yes, she does." Daniel stood, knocking the ashes from his pipe. "Something to think about if you're considering staying." He headed toward the door but paused with his hand on the knob. "Oh, and Ingram, if you do stay, you might consider calling me Daniel. Sir makes me feel even older than I am." With that, he disappeared inside, leaving Archer alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that, for the first time in years, he was contemplating a future rather than just surviving the present. 2 days later, Archer stood in Sheriff Roberts' office discussing the deputy position. The sheriff was a practical man who seemed more concerned with Archer's shooting skills and judgment than his past. "Deputy's pay isn't much," Roberts warned. $30 a month plus room at the jailhouse if you want it." "I've been staying at the Dawsons' boarding house," Archer replied. "I'd like to continue there if that's all right." Roberts raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on this. "Fine by me. When can you start?" "Today, if you need me." "Good." Roberts handed him a badge. "First order of business is to accompany me to the Miller farm. There's been some trouble with cattle rustlers in the area." As Archer pinned the badge to his shirt, a clean one, thanks to Lillian, he was struck by the strange turn his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been on the run, blood on his shirt and trouble at his heels. Now, he was accepting a position of responsibility in a community, putting down roots in a way he hadn't done since before the war. Word of his new position spread quickly through Madisonville. Some townsfolk were wary, having witnessed the confrontation with Reynolds, but most seemed willing to reserve judgment, especially with Sheriff Roberts' endorsement. Lillian, when he told her the news that evening, beamed with a mixture of pride and pleasure that warmed something long cold in Archer's chest. "Deputy Ingram," she said, testing the title. "It suits you." "Does it?" he asked, still uncertain. "Yes," she touched the badge lightly. "A protector, not a runner." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that gradually began to feel like a life rather than an interlude. Archer patrolled with Roberts, handled the occasional drunk cowboy at the saloon, and investigated reports of rustling in the outlying ranches. In his off hours, he continued to help Daniel with repairs and improvements to the boarding house. And each evening he sat with Lillian on the porch, talking about everything and nothing: his childhood in Ohio, her brief adventure in New Orleans, books they'd read, dreams they'd abandoned and ones they still harbored. One night in early autumn, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lillian asked about the scars he carried. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," she added quickly, "but I've wondered." Archer had never spoken much about his wartime experiences or the decade that followed, but with Lillian, the words came easier than he'd expected. "This one," he said, touching a long scar that ran from his collarbone down his chest, "was from Shiloh, Confederate cavalry charge. I was 18, barely knew which end of the rifle to hold." Lillian listened without interrupting as he recounted the major battles, the wounds both visible and hidden, the comrades lost and the enemies made. He told her about his time as a marshal, the outlaws he'd tracked, the lives he'd taken and saved. When he finished, the stars were out, a blanket of lights above them in the clear Texas night. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I've never told anyone all of it before," he admitted. "Not even myself, really." "Sometimes the stories we carry become lighter when we share them," she said, "like dividing a load between 2 pack horses instead of burdening just one." He squeezed her hand gently. "You're a wise woman, Lillian Dawson." "Not wise," she corrected. "Just experienced enough to know that secrets fester while truth heals." In that moment, looking at her profile against the starlit sky, Archer knew with sudden clarity that he loved her. The realization wasn't shocking or surprising, it felt like acknowledging something that had been true for some time, like finally naming a familiar constellation in the night sky. He didn't say the words aloud yet, but something must have changed in his expression, because Lillian turned to look at him with a question in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking," he said carefully, "that I'm glad I stayed." Her smile was soft in the moonlight. "So am I." As autumn progressed into winter, the relationship between Archer and Lillian deepened into something the whole town recognized, even if no formal declarations had been made. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals at the boarding house, and continued their evening conversations on the porch until the Texas winter made it too cold to sit outside. Daniel watched their growing closeness with approving eyes, and even Mrs. Whitaker, who had initially been suspicious of Archer, had taken to calling them the young couple when she gossiped with her friends. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere to Madisonville. The general store displayed ribbons and candies, the church organized a pageant, and even the saloon hung evergreen boughs over its swinging doors. Archer found himself swept up in the preparations, despite his usual avoidance of holidays. The boarding house became a center of activity, with Lillian baking cookies and pies, Daniel carving small wooden toys for the town's children, and the other boarders contributing their own traditions. 2 days before Christmas, Archer rode out to the Miller farm to follow up on another report of rustling. The ride was pleasant despite the winter chill, with clear skies and the promise of returning to the warmth of the boarding house to Lillian when his work was done. The meeting with Mr. Miller was brief. The rustlers seemed to have moved on to easier targets, perhaps discouraged by the increased patrols Archer and Sheriff Roberts had implemented. As he prepared to ride back to town, Mrs. Miller insisted on sending him with a jar of her preserved peaches, a Christmas gift for Lillian, whose fondness for the fruit was apparently well known. Archer was halfway back to Madisonville when he spotted the rider approaching from the east. Something about the man's posture, the determined set of his shoulders, put Archer on alert. He slowed his horse, his hand moving instinctively to his pistol. As the rider drew closer, Archer's suspicions solidified into recognition. Harold Bennett rode with purpose, his gaze fixed on Archer with cold determination. "Ingram," Bennett called as he drew his horse to a stop several yards away. "Been looking for you." "Bennett," Archer acknowledged, noting the rifle strapped to the man's saddle. "I heard you headed east." "I did." Bennett's eyes flickered to the badge on Archer's chest and his mouth twisted in disgust. "Deputy, playing at being the law now, not playing," Archer replied evenly. "What brings you back to these parts?" Bennett's expression hardened. "Unfinished business." "Reynolds may have lost his nerve at the end, but I haven't forgotten what you did." "Reynolds is dead because of your bullet, not mine," Archer said, keeping his voice calm despite the tension coiling in his gut. "How many more people need to die for a grudge based on a lie?" "It's not a lie," Bennett snapped, though something flickered in his eyes, doubt perhaps. "And it's just you that needs to die, then it's finished." Archer knew he should draw his gun, end this confrontation before it could escalate further. But something held him back, the badge on his chest, perhaps, or the changes these past months had wrought in him. "It doesn't have to be this way," he said. "The war's been over for a decade. Julia's death was a tragedy, but more killing won't bring her back or ease your brother's grief." Bennett's hand moved toward his pistol. "Save your preaching. You're just trying to talk your way out of what's coming to you." "No," Archer replied, making no move toward his own weapon. "I'm trying to give you a chance to walk away. Go back east, Bennett, build a new life." "That's what I'm doing here." For a moment it seemed like his words might have an impact. Bennett hesitated, his hand pausing in its movement toward his gun, then his expression hardened again. "Too late for that." Bennett drew, but Archer was faster despite his initial reluctance. His shot hit Bennett in the chest, the impact throwing the man backward off his horse. He was dead before he hit the ground, his own pistol unfired. Archer dismounted slowly, a familiar hollowness settling in his chest as he approached the body. Another death, another link in the chain of violence that had defined so much of his life. But this time it felt different. He wasn't running anymore. He had a place, a purpose, people who cared for him, and he'd given Bennett every chance to walk away. Sheriff Roberts would understand it was a clear case of self-defense, with Bennett drawing first. But Archer found himself thinking of Lillian, wondering if she would see the necessity in this killing as clearly as she had seen through the blood on his shirt that first day. He gathered Bennett's body across his horse, securing it with ropes before mounting his own steed. The ride back to Madisonville was somber, the jar of preserved peaches forgotten in his saddlebag as he contemplated what to tell Lillian. The town was quiet when he returned, most people at home preparing for the upcoming holiday. He rode directly to the sheriff's office, where Roberts took one look at the body and the grim set of Archer's jaw and began asking practical questions rather than accusations. After providing a full account and completing the necessary paperwork, Archer headed toward the boarding house. The walk seemed longer than usual, his boots heavy on the wooden sidewalk. The house was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking when he entered. Lillian emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron and a smile lighting her face until she saw his expression. "What happened?" she asked immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. "Bennett," he replied simply. "He found me on the road back from the miller's." Her eyes widened. "Are you hurt?" "No." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "But Bennett is dead. He drew on me, didn't leave me much choice." Lillian was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and embraced him, her arms wrapping around his waist and her cheek pressing against his chest. The simple acceptance in her gesture broke something loose in Archer's chest. He held her tightly, breathing in the scent of flour and cinnamon that clung to her hair. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Sorry that he forced your hand, sorry that more blood had to be spilled." "I tried to talk him down," Archer murmured into her hair. "Offered him the chance to walk away." She looked up at him, her eyes serious but gentle. "I know you did. That's who you are now, Archer, a man who offers second chances even to those who might not deserve them." He realized she was echoing his own thoughts about her from that first day, how she had offered him kindness and understanding when others would have turned away. "I learned from the best," he said, managing a small smile. She returned the smile, then stepped back slightly. "Come, sit down. I'll make you some coffee, and you can tell me everything." As he followed her to the kitchen, Archer was struck again by the remarkable woman who had seen past the blood on his shirt to the man beneath, who had offered to wash away the stains of his past, even while accepting that some marks could never be fully erased. That night, after the house had gone quiet and the other boarders had retired, Archer and Lillian sat together in the parlor. The confrontation with Bennett had been discussed, the sheriff's report filed, and their future lay before them, unwritten but full of possibility. "I've been thinking," Archer said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about staying in Madisonville permanently." Lillian looked up from her mending, her eyes meeting his. "I thought you already had decided to stay." "I had," he acknowledged, "but today made me realize something. Bennett was the last thread connecting me to my old life. With him gone, there's nothing pulling me back into the past. And that changes things for you. It clarifies things." He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Lillian, when I rode into town that day with blood on my shirt, I thought I was just passing through. Another town, another brief stop before moving on," she set aside her mending. "And now I know that some journeys end where they're meant to, even if the traveler doesn't recognize it at first." He took her hand in his. "I love you, Lillian. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you looked at that bloodstain and offered to wash it away instead of running in the other direction." Her eyes softened, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I think I started falling for you when you came back, even though leaving would have been safer. It showed me who you really are, not the man running from his past, but the man facing it to protect others. I want to build a life here," Archer continued, "with you if you'll have me." "Are you asking me to marry you, Deputy Ingram?" she teased, though her eyes were serious. "I am," he replied, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "It's not much. I'm offering a deputy's salary and a name that still carries shadows from the past. But I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life, to be honest and faithful, to build something good with you." Lillian's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Archer Ingram, shadows and all." He pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and gratitude that had been building in his heart since that first day. When they finally parted, both breathless, he remembered something. "I almost forgot," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I had this made a week ago. Was planning to wait until Christmas, but—" He pulled out a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Lillian interrupted, holding out her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with the entire town of Madisonville gathered at the small church for the holiday service. The news of Archer and Lillian's engagement had spread quickly, bringing congratulations from townsfolk who had come to accept the former drifter as one of their own. As they sat in the pew beside Daniel, who had received the news with genuine pleasure and a knowing smile, Archer found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. From the blood-soaked battlefields of the war to the quiet streets of Madisonville, from a man constantly looking over his shoulder to one looking forward to a future filled with love and purpose. The minister spoke of redemption and new beginnings, words that resonated deeply with Archer as he glanced at the woman beside him. Lillian caught his gaze and smiled, squeezing his hand as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. After the service, as they walked back to the boarding house for Christmas dinner, snow began to fall, a rare occurrence in this part of Texas. Lillian laughed with delight, turning her face up to catch the flakes on her cheeks. "My mother used to say that snow on Christmas was a sign of blessings to come," she told Archer, her eyes bright with joy. "Then we must be in for many blessings," he replied, pulling her close as they continued their walk home, their home through the gently falling snow. The wedding took place in early spring, when the Texas wildflowers were in full bloom. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church filled to capacity with people who had come to care for the deputy and the boarding house keeper's daughter. Lillian wore a dress of pale blue satin, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Archer, in a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion, found himself overcome with emotion as she walked down the aisle on Daniel's arm. The minister spoke of love and commitment, of two lives joining to create something stronger than either alone. When it came time for their vows, Archer spoke from the heart. "Lillian, you saw me when I was at my worst, blood-stained and running, and offered me kindness instead of judgment. You taught me that redemption isn't something you find on the road, but something you build day by day through the choices you make." He squeezed her hands gently. "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings. I promise to be worthy of the second chance you gave me." Lillian's eyes shimmered with tears as she spoke her own vows. "Archer, when you rode into town that day, I saw a man who needed help even if he didn't know how to ask for it. What I couldn't have known then was that you would become the greatest blessing of my life." Her voice was steady despite the emotion. "I promise to love you completely, to believe in you even when you doubt yourself, and to build a life with you filled with honesty, joy, and purpose." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Archer caught sight of Sheriff Roberts nodding approvingly, Mrs. Whitaker dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Daniel watching with paternal pride. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from the trees. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, the community coming together to celebrate the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. As the evening wore on, Archer and Lillian found a moment alone on the porch where they had spent so many evenings getting to know one another. "Happy, Mrs. Ingram?" Archer asked, still savoring the sound of her new name. "Completely," she replied, nestling into his arms. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He kissed the top of her head. "I keep thinking about that first day when you offered to wash my shirt. Such a simple thing, but it changed everything." "It wasn't just the shirt," Lillian said, looking up at him. "It was the man wearing it." "I saw something in your eyes, pain, yes, but also decency. Worth. I just had to convince you to see it too." Archer smiled, thinking of how far he'd come from that blood-stained rider with trouble at his heels. "You're a remarkable woman, Lillian Ingram." "And you're a good man, Archer Ingram," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him as the stars began to appear in the Texas sky above them. In the years that followed, the legend of the blood-stained cowboy and the laundress who loved him became part of Madisonville's folklore. Archer continued to serve as deputy, eventually becoming sheriff when Roberts retired. Lillian managed the boarding house after Daniel's passing, turning it into one of the most respected establishments in the county. They had 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, though the tale grew more romantic and less bloody with each telling. The grandchildren would hear it too, gathered around the fireplace in the house Archer built for Lillian on a plot of land at the edge of town, with a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs where they could watch the sunset together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when they sat on that porch, Archer would take Lillian's hand and thank her again for that day so many years ago, when a woman had looked at a blood-stained shirt and seen not a reason to turn away, but an opportunity to help when she had said those simple words that changed the course of his life. "Then let me wash it anyway." In those moments, watching the Texas sun sink below the horizon with the woman he loved beside him, Archer Ingram knew that redemption wasn't found in running away from one's past, but in facing it head-on, in the daily choice to build something good and true, in the courage to stop long enough to let someone else see the man behind the blood and the scars. And in the peaceful town of Madisonville, Texas, that's exactly what he had done.